wood carvings in the sea. Then they prepare, so Greece, jets out into the Mediterranean Sea there in Europe. Then they prepare baskets with images of Adonis and flowers. And these flowers are called little gardens of Adonis. So they have these in these baskets, along with the images of Adonis. And so they take these baskets and float them on the river. And the river carries the baskets away downstream. So, like I said, this is when they're celebrating it at the beginning of spring. And so they have their wood carvings cast in the sea, prepare their Adonis baskets, little gardens of Adonis. And so 7 days later, the red anemones bloom in the woods. This is signifying Adonis's resurrection. And then they indulge in rejoicing at the resurrection of Adonis and the earth. So this coming to life is associated with Adonis coming to life again. So that's the Greek god. Osiris is the Egyptian god. Okay, and then we have Astora, which was the Anglo-Saxon god, and that's the area of what Anglo-Saxons like England, Germany, all there in Europe. And so Astora has a little story here as well. Okay, Astora's life was saved by a bird whose wings had frozen by the winter's cold. So after Adonis was saved by this bird turned into a hare that could lay eggs. So, initially being a bird, but, it's frozen and, doesn't have wings, so I guess that made it into a hare. Fascinating these gods are. Okay, so the hare became Astora's constant companion. And the rabbit also is a sacred animal in ancient societies. And our zoology expert told us about the rabbit, what made it such a significant animal due to its reproduction abilities. So, that said, coming from the ancient worships, we're moving along into Jewish worship, okay? Hebrew Jewish worship. So what is it that coincides with the Christian celebration in the Jewish world? What event do the Jews celebrate in spring?
Passover.
The Passover, okay? So we have this worship of the Passover, and what happened, let's see, what happened at the Passover? Who knows, what are we talking about? They made nice pictures. I should have held up this picture. Very nice. Heavenly bodies, the pagans worship. Okay, then we have Passover. Let's see, I think I have your Passover, don't I? Or do you have your Passover? This is Valerie. Now we got the Passover. You draw the Passover. So I see her picture. Passover. Anyway, what is it that happened at the Passover? Passover?
When the angel was passing over and they had to put blood on their frame to the doors so that their firstborn wouldn't die. So
the firstborn wouldn't die. So this is significant. The Hebrews are about to be emancipated from their Egyptian bondage, and Pharaoh wouldn't let them go through 9 plagues. It came to the 10th plague. The death angel was coming around to kill all of the firstborn in Egypt. And in order for the Israelites to not be affected by this, they had to kill a lamb and put blood on the doorpost, and the death angel would pass over them, and their, firstborn would not be killed. So, this holiday, Passover, falls on a certain time of the year. And let's see, it's the Jews go by a different calendar. They have a Jewish calendar, and their calendar is calculated by the moon. And so we talked about the new moon, and the month started with the new moon. So what does the moon look like when it's a new moon? Remember? Louder. Can't hear.
Can't see it.
Can't see it. Okay, so a new moon, you know, the cycles go, you know, the Earth is between the sun and the moon reflects the sun's light. So when the Earth is totally blocking the sun's rays to the moon, that's what they call the new moon, and you can't see anything. Then as, you know, the revolutions go, the moon gradually grows. So you get a, you know, the crescent, half moon, and then you get the full moon, right? So the beginning of the month is the new moon, and you can't see anything. So the day that the Jews celebrated the Passover was the 15th of Nisan, the month Nisan, and Nisan, the 15th of Nisan, usually by the 15th of the month, the moon has grown into a full moon. So you have a full moon when they are starting to celebrate this Passover. Okay. Okay, so that's the Jewish worship system and what they're worshiping and when they're worshiping it. Okay. This Nisan is a month that coincides with our, it's kind of like a mid-month to mid-month on our calendar, March to April. Okay, so that is the time they are celebrating their Passover in that month of Nisan. So the 15th of Nisan, then it is falling at what time? When what is happening?
Spring equinox.
The spring equinox. So this is about the time they are celebrating the Passover. So we have the ancient people, pagans. At this spring equinox, they're celebrating the beginning of spring. We have the Jews after the Passover has occurred, you know, after they were delivered from Egypt, then they start celebrating this great celebration at the spring equinox. Okay, we move on to our third worship group here, and this is the Christian worship group here in the spring. And what is it that the Christians celebrate about this time? What's happening? What happened at this time with the Christians? You know what happened for the Christians? No. You know what happened for the Christians? What happened, Eddie? What is it? They're celebrating.
The resurrection.
Right, the resurrection of Jesus. Okay? So, Jesus was a Jew, okay? But he came to bring in a new worship. You know, that it's no longer going to be the Moses law and, you know, all your Passover and all that. All of this symbolized Jesus, okay? And that's what, you know, God chose the Jews and, you know, gave them all these rituals and whatnot to observe, but they were foreshadowing the coming Messiah. So when Jesus did come, some of the Jews accepted him and some of them didn't. Those that didn't, they're still celebrating Passover today. But those that have, and it wasn't only for the Jews, and Jesus is, his salvation is all inclusive. You don't have to be in a certain family or lineage or whatever. So, Jesus fulfilled the law, and he symbolizes, the Passover symbolizes his death and his work that he did for the salvation of mankind. So now, talking about the Christian worship of the crucifixion and the resurrection, at what time did all this happen when Jesus was going through? We called it, there was a certain word we called his suffering and death, the resurrection. What was that word? You know? The Passion. Yeah, you ever heard of a passion play or whatever? This is the enactment of Jesus' suffering, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. So when did Jesus' passion start? What time of year was that? What was it? Remember the Jews, they were observing something. What were they observing? The time of Jesus' suffering? What was it that the Jesus, you know, when he entered into Jerusalem, and he knows he's going to the cross, he enters into Jerusalem, they lay palms down and so forth, and then Jesus told his disciples to get a place where they could have dinner, and, you know, they get that, and so they had this dinner, but what kind of dinner was it that they were having? They were Jewish.
Last Supper?
The Last Supper. You've seen the pictures, all the men laying on each other at a long table. And the Last Supper. The Last Supper was a celebration of what? These were Jews celebrating what? The Last Supper.
Passover?
Passover. Right. So this is the Jewish Passover that they were celebrating. You know, they had their lamb and unleavened bread and whatnot, and they were celebrating at this time. So we know that Jesus' death and resurrection took place in the same time period as the Passover. Okay? So in knowing that, and knowing how the Jewish calendar was calculated by the moon, and so this event is occurring at what celestial happening? Everybody?
Spring
equinox. Yes! So we have 3 worship things going on at the time of the spring equinox. That's what I was trying to get across. So, okay. Now, we talked about Estora. Okay. Spring. Okay. So now we get to where, okay, you have these celebrations going on with these different societies, groups of people, and so we come down to our day, and we have a day called Easter. We can see where the name comes from, and actually, also, if someone could get Acts chapter 12. Anybody? Yeah, Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 4.
Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hand to avenge certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people.
Okay, so the word Easter is in the Bible. And I'm assuming it is, Easter was the official name of the spring equinox. So I guess back then, they termed that time of the year, in recognizing its beginning of spring, Easter. And this is, that was the story of, when they got Peter in jail and they were getting ready to kill him. And of course, the angel came down and released him. So, we have Easter is when we have come to celebrate Christ. But around the Easter time, you also see the rabbits and the eggs, baskets, and all of that Peter Cottontail, and and all that kind of stuff. So it genders some type of rather confusion, as to us Christians. So what are these all about? So this is where these things come from. And so I guess this will be my last point here of how these things became integrated into Christian worship. Okay? So now this part of it, I'm trying not to make it too long here, but it actually is part of our Revelation teaching. Because after Jesus set his church up, he died, he rose again, and the church grew and multiplied. And it was riding high and then began to kind of decline. So about in the 4th century, we have the risings of certain religious organization that is considered Christian. It's known as Catholicism. It was based in Rome. Okay, Rome, it was because this was the rise of the Roman Empire. Now, the emperors of Rome, they were not particularly religious, but they, went forth to conquer. So they conquered all of this area around in the Mediterranean. You have Italy and Greece, and even along the northern coast of Africa, Egypt, and what's that area called Mesopotamia and all that. All of that area was considered the Roman Empire. So about in the year 300, we have this emperor named Constantine came on the scene. And Constantine, somewhere along the line, had a conversion, and he was zealous for the cause of Christ. So he's over this vast empire, and they're realizing in conquering these various areas, these are pagan areas. You have Egypt, we read about an Egyptian god, Greece, we read about the Grecian gods. Even, Paul preached on Mars Hill. Was that in Greece? I mean, they were pagans. And so when this government conquered all these areas, this empire, they had these folks indulged in their pagan idolatrous worship. So Constantine, in his zeal for being converted, he wanted to Christianize the Roman Empire. So in doing so, let's see, the Christians were being persecuted pretty bad, but he made it illegal to persecute the Christians, the Edict of Milan in 313. And then Easter was established by the First Council of Nicaea in 325, year 325. Okay, so they then, the early Christian leaders, they wanted to keep the Passover tied to the death and resurrection of Christ for symbolic reasons. And so that, stuck that together. So when you get to singling out this event of Easter, meaning the resurrection of Christ, they wanted to establish a certain day for it. So that day was established as the first Sunday after the full moon following the vernal equinox. So you have the equinox, which, begins, in that month, end of March, beginning of April, is when the equinox starts, about the end of March. So the first full moon following that equinox comes somewhere maybe in the middle of the month of April, and then the first Sunday after that. So this is why Easter is on different days each year. They're going by the moon, and it's different days each year. And so this being tied with the Jewish Passover, it came to be that Easter also fluctuated in what day it was. So moving on in the Roman Empire, about 100 to 200 years later, that's when the Roman Empire, now trying to force Christianity on all of their domain. So we have a head now. The church is going to dictate how people worship and what they do. And this figure rose up in the Catholic Church. And this figure is called a what? Pope. Okay, so this is the rise of the Pope, and they're stationed in Rome. And this particular Pope, Pope Gregory, he was around in about 595. He commissioned a mission of monks to go and convert pagans to Christianity. So they're still having a problem with these pagans worshiping and going on. And so he commissioned these monks to go and make them Christians. And so he came up with a strategy. Actually, one of the monks, I think, Augustine? No, let's see. Well, together probably they came up with a strategy of how to Christianize these pagan folks, worshiping all these gods and all these things. So they had, as we heard, rituals and customs whereby they worship these gods. And so it says, they said to allow the outward forms of the old heathen festivals and beliefs to remain intact. They wanted them to still carry on in these forms of worship, but said, wherever possible, superimpose Christian ceremonies and philosophies on them. So instead of worshiping Adonis, let's say you're worshiping Christ, or worshiping, St. Peter, or worshiping, Mary, or whatever. So they imposed Christian figures to worship instead of the heathen gods. So let's see, it's a little right here. Okay, I'll try to do this real quick. The sheer scale of the task confronting the little band of missionaries was so colossal that halfway on the long trudge to Rome, they got cold feet and they wanted to turn back. But they wouldn't let them. They said, no, you go and try to convert these folks. So what they were dealing with, they said, leaving the festivals aside, okay, yeah, all that was going on. But see, these pagans, they believed that every plant, tree, spring, stream, rock, hill, animals, mountains, springs, drunk from, whatever, that they, worship them, and before they could even cross a stream, or drink from a stream, or climb a mountain, or whatever, that they had to entreat the God of that particular thing. So, they still,